Right, let's get started. I'm your moderator, Joanna Chiu. I'm a former China-based correspondent, currently a journalist at the Toronto Star, and my research is examining China's disorderly relations with the West is China Unbound, and Dan Harris made me bring it to show you. There it is, thanks Dan. I'm very excited to facilitate this discussion on the changes that have taken place in China, the impact on global businesses, and potential solutions. We will devote about 20 minutes each to each section, change, impact, and solutions, and then open up to a Q&A for as long as possible because we received many of your excellent questions. This webinar will be recorded, but I won't be reading out your names when I read out the questions. Look out for the replay on YouTube and the Harris-Bricken blog. And we will be covering a lot of ground as it's clear that concerns for China business in connection to Russia's war in Ukraine is only the tip of the iceberg, only the latest geopolitical risk, in addition to ongoing issues such as the COVID-19 pandemic, labor rights in China, US-China and China-Western trade tensions, and the crackdowns and human rights abuses in places like Xinjiang and Hong Kong. And right now with Shanghai under lockdown, as you all know, or maybe experiencing, there are major supply chain disruptions from factory closures. These and other issues that our extremely knowledgeable panelists will cover have pushed companies to make plans to protect both your businesses and the people and your partners in China in the event of future conflicts, pandemics, other geopolitical issues. So it's great that we're all here. I'm going to be discussing all of these things. In my own research, traveling around to different Western countries to do case studies, you know, a common problem is that both elites in business and government have seemed to underestimate the challenges of working in China. Some people still repeat this kind of myth that there is a simple, just a vast opportunities from the fact that China is so large, the population is so large. And there hasn't been enough effort to understand how to mitigate these serious challenges. So I'm so confident that our panelists with their real world experience and expertise are talking about the very things that we need to be paying attention to now. So I would like to introduce our great panelists today. We have Dan Harris, founding member of Harris-Bricken, an international law firm with lawyers in the United States, Brazil, China, Mexico, and Spain. Dan's legal practice focuses on protecting businesses and governments overseas. And Isaac Stone-Fish, he's the CEO and founder of StrategyRisks, a firm which helps companies and institutions understand and reduce their China risk. He's also a former journalist like I am. He's the author of the book that I have read, which is great, America Second, regular speaker at events around the world. And Brent Carlson, last but not least, is our director of AlixPartners, with over 25 years of hands-on China business experience, both as an external consultant and in internal management roles. He helps companies grow strategically and preserve their value with elegant solutions to navigate pitfalls like the ones we'll be talking about around compliance, corruption, and fraud. So let's jump right into it. From each of your perspectives and, you know, long track record of experience, how do you think China has changed in a holistic sense? Not just talking about from the perspective of companies, but just your observations internally as well as China's international position.
I can get started with that one. I'd see radical changes over the last several years. One is Chairman Xi's strong leftward turn, which has left a lot smaller space for innovative Chinese businesses like Alibaba, Meituan, and even Tencent to grow. The second is the crimes against humanity and genocide in Xinjiang, the northwest Chinese region, where upwards of 1 million Muslims have been held in concentration camps. The third is COVID, which I think took everyone by surprise, both Beijing's early successes and its current paranoia that we're seeing in Shanghai and Beijing and other parts around the country. And then fourth is this growing assertiveness and also awareness that tensions between China and the United States will likely continue to grow. And not to start off the panel on such a dire note, but it does appear that Beijing is moving towards war footing or is even on war footing in some ways because of its fears around the United States.
Yeah, I can follow on some of those comments as well. I mean, basically, I've seen China starting to turn more inward, going all the way back even 15 years ago. There was a book that came out that said, 中国可以说不, China can say no. And that was really kind of the shift where China went through this long period of looking around the world for international models to help its development, to take it to the next level. And then it just started to shift. And then around that time, around 2005, and then after the global financial crisis, basically, it was a jettison of that sort of approach, and then turning radically inward. And so it's just a different environment. And now you do have these geopolitical tensions that are rising, and it's clear. I mean, it's clear the target from the Chinese government's perspective on who their main adversary is. It's ironically at an individual level, the peoples between the United States and China actually have a lot of connections, but at that leadership level, it's become totally different.
And the only thing I would add is that I've seen all of this reflected on the legal side over the years, whereby when I first started dealing with China, things got better every single year with respect to the law and the enforcement of the law. And that stopped roughly 2013, let's say, and it basically plateaued there. And probably around 2016, 2017, things started progressively getting worse in terms of enforcement. And it really accelerated 2 or 3 years ago in terms of both the laws and the enforcement. Mostly overall, meaning, and Isaac referred to this, things got tougher for all businesses in China, but things got even tougher for foreign businesses.
So you have all worked with so many different companies who do a host of different businesses related to China. From your observations, has it been tougher for foreign companies to operate in China now, even compared to 5 years ago? You're all nodding, so.
Okay, I'll go first because my answer is going to be very short. What I always tell people is that in the last 3 to 5 years, the number of clients that our law firm services has, clients that are doing business with China, has declined every year, but our revenue has risen, meaning revenue is up with fewer clients. That's because there's more legal work necessary, and that's because China has become far more complicated.
Mm-hmm. Isaac?
So we've seen folks be very concerned about safety and regulatory issues in China. The regulations on both the US and the Chinese side, the US side, especially the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which is implemented in late June, which will restrict and ban exports from Xinjiang and other provinces that touch Xinjiang in various supply chain ways. But also, I think there's growing concerns that Chinese staff working for certain foreign companies could be at risk of Beijing's regulatory changes. And we've seen that for a long time in journalism. We're starting to see that more and more, quietly but pointedly in other industries as well.
And from my perspective, over the years, basically the key to a successful business in China was to align your business with whatever were the developmental objectives that the Chinese government had at any given time. And these were laid out in the 5-year plans and it was fairly transparent. As long as you would align yourself, it would be fine. And for, I would say, for the first, couple decades even, that I was doing business in China, those largely aligned because China wanted to increase its industrial base. It wanted to increase its technological capabilities, and that all was fine. Now we're starting to see a little bit of a divergence. I mean, the economy is slowing structurally, so those big boom days are gone. And now you look at where China is at in its developmental trajectory, its economic development trajectory. It has to increase technology. There's like basically it's already run the avenues of population growth. That's gone as an engine. Investing in capital and new infrastructure and property, plant, and equipment. That's largely over. So it's got to be productivity. Where does the productivity come? It comes through technology. And so combine that with the desire to obtain intellectual property any way, shape, or form, with China's new directive of basically you've got civil military fusion being driven by its domestic political and geopolitical concerns. So it's creating a bit of a divergence where in the past there was a close convergence.
Mm-hmm. So just to kind of sum up, so Dan, you were talking about how for a while you saw improvements in China's, regulatory legal environment, but that stalled, particularly under Xi Jinping. And Brent, and Isaac, you talk about all of these different regulations that seem to do harm, even to China's own companies, China's own entrepreneurs, which definitely I saw on the ground as a reporter. There are lots of frustrated Chinese people that I spoke with. Would you say that what's happening is that maybe the Chinese Communist Party's political concerns and anxieties are overtaking some of the more pragmatic legal and economic steps that they could be taking instead?
Exactly, that's very well said. I think there's a strong turn towards national security, and I think companies globally need to understand that both the United States and China and a lot of other jurisdictions are going to focus on regulations that may harm bottom lines in the search for national security.
And we can also talk about the U.S. side. The U.S. might also take actions that harms its business and ties with China business in the name of national security. So speaking of national security, talking about Russia's war in Ukraine right now, a lot of us, here attending want to know what you think. How will the ongoing war, how is it impacting people who do business with China? What does it mean for foreign companies, inside or just doing some business related to China right now?
Okay, yeah, I'll start with this because it has had less of an impact than I expected. And that's because I thought China would not back down on its full-throated support of Russia. I thought China would violate the sanctions in great numbers. And I turned out to be wrong on that. So the impacts have been less. There definitely have been impacts, and I'll turn it over to Isaac and Brent to talk about some of those, but it has been less direct than I expected they would be.
I think that's right. It's probably less direct, but there's two important things that I look at it from the Russia's war in Ukraine. Number one is that geopolitical tensions are real, and those tensions can boil over at any time. I mean, a couple months ago, there was a cover of The Economist that had the U.S. and China one accident away from military disaster. That's still real, and words matter, rhetoric matters. And at a certain point, these things can just boil over. The second piece is China is Russia's largest trading partner. It's also Iran's largest trading partner. And there have been past cases that have shown that entities in China, including subsidiaries of foreign multinationals, can and do sell to sanctioned entities and locations. So that the risk is really on that underneath part, not necessarily I think the Chinese government coming out and just saying no, back in their face, United States, but what's going out the back door. And from a company's perspective, how is your compliance program in terms of being able to sort of catch that? Because definitely the United States and the European Union and its allies, quite frankly, are going to be increasing scrutiny in terms of compliance in that regard. That writing is clear and on the wall.
That's a great point, Brent. And I think it's great that you brought up compliance. There are so many rules and regulations that for so long US bodies have tolerated that I think there's going to be a lot stronger enforcement on. In terms of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we've seen two moves from the business community on that, speaking broadly. One is a growing awareness that if China invades Taiwan, there might be a similar response in terms of a move to boycott companies, a move to scramble out of China. And a lot of companies are very privately starting to wrestle with this idea of, oh, if geopolitical tensions really worsen, does that mean we have to get out? What does that look like? How do we do it in a comprehensive and safe way? And the second piece is the fear of secondary sanctions. And Dan, I agree with you. We haven't really seen the levels of sanctions violations that we thought we would. It's still early, and there are folks that are worried, especially in the energy space, that their investments or partnerships in China might expose them to secondary sanctions risks or other types of risks as those companies continue to work with Russian partners.
Yeah. One of the things I always talk about that it seems very few people talk about is what I would describe as the reputational popularity boycott risks that companies face in China. And companies were pretty much ignoring that until Russia. And then they saw how quickly the world coalesced against Russia. And Isaac talked about this, that now companies are very concerned about that. And it should be a very real concern, because the world is energized against Russia. If China does too much to help Russia, the world could very well become energized against China. Flipping that switch won't be that tough. And actually, this morning, I read the results of a recent survey in the United States. And the survey said that I think it was 73% of Americans are willing to want tariffs against China, and are willing to pay more for their products to have them. And the shocking number is that only, I think it was 10% opposed them. The other percent were undecided. The United States is becoming energized against China, and a lot of, whenever I write something about this, I also say the EU is as well, and people always say, no, that's not true. But it is true, because we have a lot of EU clients. We do a lot of business with the EU, and they're right in step with the United States. It doesn't necessarily mean their governments are, but their people are, in terms of China. And there's also Japan, Australia, New Zealand, etc.
Definitely been more and more unity in some of the skepticism towards China, the wariness. But there have been more mixed messages, because I'm also seeing, experts say that what's happening in Russia could push, Washington and Beijing actually closer together, because, Washington understands China is Russia's largest trading partner, like, key ally, especially now. So there might be more a willingness from the US to kind of have a softer tone towards Beijing. Some say the opposite. It depends on what, China and Chinese companies do, the extent of support for Russia. So, trying to make sense of all of this, especially, you don't speak Chinese, you see kind of just quick translations of what Chinese state media is saying, which sometimes can be quite alarming, because some of the statements seem quite supportive of Russia. What are the best ways for companies to try to get an accurate picture of this quickly evolving picture?
Yeah, I'll start with that. Basically, I like to think of it as a mosaic. It's a concept. The mosaic concept is something that I like to do, like when I've been involved in certain fraud-related matters and putting the picture together. But when you're looking at like a complex situation, you look at all the data points, and you'll see a lot of different things. But if you looked at them all in aggregate, you will definitely see patterns appearing. And so And this just, it started a conversation I had about a year ago with a client who said, I've got a lot of people telling me all these different things, but where is this all heading? And so just take a step back, just look at all your data sources that you're looking at, your media, from your customers, your suppliers, your business partners, and then all that sort of news. Is it conducive to a more positive business environment, or is it going to make it eroding the business environment? And if you look at it overwhelmingly, the situation is not heading in the positive direction necessarily. So I'd look at it that way.
Yeah, I agree. In fact, using Brent's data point term, I haven't seen, I can't even think of a data point in the last 6 months that indicates China doing what it can to integrate with the world. And I see a lot of data points indicating that it wants to decouple. They've issued proclamations effectively saying we will go it alone. And a data point from this morning is Al Jazeera did an article today or yesterday talking about how something like 40% of the staff at the international schools in China are expected to be gone before the next school year starts. And so you might hear that number and think, well, who cares about schools? But it's just one more thing that's sort of accelerating people leaving.
And the removal of English from the public transportation signs. I mean, that's all a move like, okay, we don't need this anymore. We're turning inward. It's like, it's different.
Yeah, so we're already getting questions saying like, please elaborate on the risks for local staff of foreign companies, the risks for foreign companies operating in China. So let's dig into more of the impact, because clearly we're all eager to kind of get more details. So Isaac, can you elaborate more on what you mean by, local staff or local partners in the business world being more impacted now?
Definitely. And this goes off Brent's point about how to get information from China. So there's certain types of information that companies should not ask their Chinese staff or their staff based in China about. And it's not because the Chinese staff is incapable or not smart enough or not sophisticated enough. Oftentimes they understand these issues a lot better than we do. Rather, because of Chinese laws and because of the sort of the ways around the laws or the ways that the party implements the laws, there are wide areas that are dangerous for Chinese staff to be involved with. So I'll give a couple of examples for that. Let's say you're a big US bank and you're debating whether to work with Bank of China or ICBC, but you're worried about sanctions risk because one of those banks, say, works with Russia or North Korea or does something else. If you ask your Chinese staff to research sanctions risk, that could potentially ensnare them in an issue of China's anti-foreign sanctions law, which criminalizes advocacy for sanctions. It could be seen as giving information to the enemy. It could get someone upset and get them in trouble. We see that with sanctions. We see that a lot with Xinjiang. So a lot of times companies will say to us, well, we'd love to send someone to a factory in Xinjiang to see if there's forced labor. And that is something we strongly recommend against, not only because it's not a great way to get information, but also because you're putting the employee who's going to the factory in danger. You're also putting the people at the factory in danger. So with Xinjiang, it's very conceivable that there are plenty of factories there that aren't using forced labor, but the mere fact of trying to prove that can get people working at those factories in trouble. So it is something that we strongly encourage people use with open source. And a lot of the work we do at StrategyRisks is using open source methodology to try to find out what these linkages are. Make another point, again, it's a grim one, but I think it's important to talk about when we're thinking through risks. If the US and China go to war, whether over Taiwan or Japan or Korea or another country or Ukraine, it's possible that a lot of the foreign staff in China and the Chinese staff who have worked or are working for American companies might be seen as foreign combatants and treated very harshly. And it's something I worry about in the United States too, but I worry about it much more with China. And we strongly encourage companies have a plan that will allow for the movement of people if tensions are to worsen like that. And I think one of the lessons Beijing might be learning from Ukraine is don't telegraph so much what you're doing, just do it. So it is something that could happen very quickly.
And I would just add to that, you talk about using open sources. A lot of the really excellent reporting on what's happening in China lately has been, reporters and academics who speak Chinese and can find and analyze these sources. So, having, the resources in your company, just simply to read Chinese, I think it makes such a big difference. It's as if some people treat Chinese as a secret code, but actually lots of people speak it and can, analyze that, who aren't Chinese nationals, who are more at risk. But kind of taking a step backwards, Dan and Brent, can you give us more of an overview of the wider types of impact on companies? Because you seem to all agree that companies right now tend to be quite overexposed in their China business to risk. Can you kind of paint a picture of how the average company is exposed, like in which areas? Maybe Dan first and then Brent.
Okay. My answer is going to be heavily biased to what we're seeing as a law firm. And that what we're seeing is IP risks and data risks, which to me are data is usually IP as well. It's that the protections of IP have declined in China. The companies in China know that it has declined, and they're leaping in to take advantage of it. And when it comes to data protection, there is, in my view, literally no data protection. The Chinese laws allow the government to knock on your door and demand to see your data. And that not only includes data in China, it includes data on a server in France or in New Zealand. And when I tell clients this, they say, well, okay, they can do it in the United States too. And they're not doing it very often in either place. And I always point out, well, they don't do it very often in either place. That's true. In the United States, you are supposed to go to a court and get a subpoena. That's supposed to be a protection, and it generally is. There's no such protection in China. But the difference in China is that I think the reason they're not knocking on doors is because they don't need to knock on doors, because they have internet access to pretty much all the data to begin with, because all the cloud servers in China are, including those that people think are owned by big US companies, are really owned by Chinese companies that don't want the government knocking on their door.
In terms of the risks where I see, I've done a lot of work on troubleshooting issues in China, investments in China. So fraud in the operations, dealing with corruption issues. And I saw the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act rise from a sleeper law. It really was. I mean, it came into effect in late 1970s, and it really wasn't enforced until about 20 years ago. Where I see it now is trade compliance, and it cuts right to the core of the businesses, that everybody doing business there, both on the supply chain with potential forced labor in the supply chain. And it's not just in Xinjiang either, because there have been Uyghur work teams that have been shipped around the country, brought to plants under police escort. So that's one issue. The other side too is on the market side with trade compliance, and this is basically export controls. Export controls was another. It's been historically kind, a little bit like the FCPA was, but look at what's happening now. You've got the Export Control Reform Act. Then you had new updates to the Export Administration Regulations. And then look what's happening. Look who's the head of Bureau of Industry and Security. It's a former Department of Defense official. Look who's the head of enforcement. That's a former DOJ prosecutor. So there's going to be some cases there. And where the risk is, it's going to come in, where I see it, it's going to come in M&A successor liability. Company A buys Company B. The seller has reps and warranties saying that they're compliant, but lo and behold, you look under the hood, 20% of revenue is potentially compromised, and that it's in an area that is not. So those are areas to really watch it. And there was a great case last year with SAP. Now that was dealing with SAP made a series of acquisitions, including a number in Silicon Valley. But there was no post acquisition integration of the compliance function. Typically, I mean, unless let's be honest, at the end of the day, a lot of companies look at it as a cost function and they cut those budgets, post acquisition. That's going to change. And already the U.S. authorities can go out to companies without a subpoena. They call it their outreach program, and they'll come and ask you about your compliance program. And the connections with China, especially in the technology sector, are really sensitive, and it's going to have increasing scrutiny.
Yeah, so we're getting some questions coming in about, more specifically COVID-19, which has been, say, the main disruptor. So, one point is some people think we don't necessarily need to overhaul our business because eventually the pandemic will end. China's showing some signs that its COVID zero policy, it recognizes it's not sustainable. So things might open up and, it'd be better eventually. Now, how would you respond to that? That this is a temporary issue that we don't have to keep worrying about. And secondly, Isaac, a question for you. You talked about, don't ask your local staff to do sanctions research because that could be illegal, could get them in trouble. How about, to what extent can companies rely on their local staff on the ground to give an accurate picture of what it's like to operate with COVID-19 measures, or is that considered sensitive as well? So COVID, is it going to be over soon and companies don't have to worry about it? And also specifically, and then Isaac, you can come in.
I think, so I can answer the second part first. So there's no normal with business in China, and perhaps you could make that argument with countries around the world. It's not going to go back to some sort of antediluvian paradise of, Hu Jintao and 12% growth. Other things will continue to happen, and the thesis of a lot of work that we do is firms misprice their China risk because they'll see the positive things that happen with Tesla or Goldman Sachs, and they won't think about all of the messy failures of investors in China. And so that if they really follow the numbers and step back and do better audits on it, they'll make different business decisions. I think that's similar with COVID as well. Beijing will shift its strategy about COVID at some point. Maybe it'll be around the Spring Festival, maybe it will be around the Party Congress later this fall, but that's going to happen, and then there will be other changes, some that'll be very difficult to predict. And with this idea of how sensitive is COVID, I think it depends. I think you have to contextualize that one. It can be sensitive depending on what they're saying, but there's a big difference between sitting down with a Chinese staff in a cafe in Amsterdam or New York and speaking to them over the phone or via email, which is not encrypted and can't really be encrypted if they're calling in from China. And so you just have to understand that they almost certainly know that people can listen and take it with a grain of salt. Again, not because they don't have a sophisticated understanding, but because they know they're being monitored.
Yeah. Sadly, COVID is one of my favorite topics because I think the West has gotten COVID very wrong with respect to China. At the end of last year, I wrote on how we should expect there to be massive lockdowns in China because Omicron would spread and China would stick with its zero COVID policy. most people wrote and said, you're wrong on both of those things. They'll be able to keep it under control like they have. Well, I think those people ignored the facts. And the facts are that China's vaccines are not very good. They're particularly bad at preventing infection. And they haven't even reached all that many in the population, particularly the older people. So they were wrong about the spread. And I think they were wrong about zero COVID. And I actually disagree with Isaac on this. I do not see zero COVID going away, because I think a lot of people think, well, it doesn't really make sense. It's going to disappear. The CCP is smart. The CCP is smart. And I suspect that if I were the CCP, I would have a zero COVID policy in China as well, because China's health system is not good. And if COVID spreads, it could literally, well, I shouldn't say literally, it could collapse. In fact, it would collapse. And the CCP knows that. And also the CCP has staked its legitimacy on its having done a much better job with COVID than the rest of the world. And what is meant by much better job is fewer hospitalizations, fewer deaths. And I do not see them backing down from zero COVID. I'm not even sure they want to. Depending on the day, I sometimes buy into this conspiracy theory that this whole business of lockdowns is a test. They started with Shenzhen, where they test everything. Then they went after the internationalists in Shanghai. I have people in China, and who knows what the numbers really are, who say that Shanghai really wasn't that bad for COVID, that it really was just a test. If you want to control your people, you set up cages, those green cages, and not let them out of their compounds. And maybe that's what's going on there. So I'm incredibly pessimistic about COVID in China, and I think companies ignore it at their peril. And I also think that companies think that, oh, COVID's bad. It's led to a 20% decrease in shipments. I can handle that 20%. But the 20% doesn't work that way. We have clients who literally haven't gotten any products whatsoever for months. And then we have some clients who have had no problems. So if you know exactly which end of that spectrum your company's going to be on, good for you. But I'm not sure anyone really knows that.
I think Danny make a good point about the healthcare system, because that was always sort of the issue everywhere around the world when you had waves of COVID coming through. The big risk is overrunning healthcare systems that have been underfunded in the United States and a lot of other places for a long time. And so that's really the key risk. And I think that's the party's smart, the leadership they're smart, they know that those risks. The one thing though, I take a step back and just look how ham-handed it is though. I mean, the way things roll in China, things can change like that. It can change overnight. I feel like if Didi Chuxing's listing in the New York Stock Exchange, well, that's gone. Can't do that. So or something things can just happen overnight by government. Or I was going to say education companies in China, being cracked down on that. So you had areas of, like that was an area of business where, from an investor perspective, you would have thought, oh, you've got the emphasis on education. You think that's going to be an area that's going to be a good place that's going to grow, ceteris paribus. Yeah, but the government comes in and says no, because they want to control the message in terms of education. It's a different environment.
Yeah.
And handed.
We are going to move on to solutions soon, because I think that's the tricky part. Like, how do you navigate all this? But one more question, just to paint a picture of impact. Audience member pointed out that impact might be different for a small, medium-sized, or Fortune 100 firm. Could you actually give concrete examples of how you notice the impact of all of these issues impact different sized companies. Like paint a little picture of how one company encountered a whole host of issues that quickly disrupted your business, and how it was different for them based on their size and their number of resources and ability to devote a lot of money to quickly restructure.
So I can paint a composite picture for confidentiality reasons. So every company in China that gets at least 3 people has to have some form of party representation, and that covers the vast majority of companies operating in China. And we've seen party reps grow more assertive and individuals grow more worried about directions within the company about the party. We feel like in terms of the difference between small companies and large companies, on the one hand, if you're small, you can fly under the radar. On the other hand, you might not necessarily have the allies that you need at middle or senior levels of the government and the party. And one thing that I think is changing, and I'm glad this is changing, for so long, large companies would say, oh, don't worry about us. One of our board members is the nephew of this high-ranking official. And then 3 weeks later, you'd read in the news that that high-ranking official is being looked at for corruption, and you realize, oh, that's a real liability where you thought that was an asset. So I think with the anti-corruption campaign that's been going on for quite some time now, it hasn't really ended. Companies are more aware that the idea is to have a real understanding of the party's impact on your business, as opposed to hiring guides to be the ones who can shield you from those, because the winds are shifting so rapidly in China as well that often those don't offer the protection that you need.
I think that the smaller and the mid-sized companies are at greater risk for a lot of reasons. The big companies are very quietly moving a lot of their production out of China. They have the people who know how to do that. They have the money to do it. A lot of our clients are mid-sized companies. A lot of them are having their widgets made in China, and they are paralyzed to a certain extent because they don't have expertise in chasing down alternative suppliers in Guatemala or wherever. And so a lot of them are, I feel, almost sticking their heads in the sand. And they've been doing that for years now. They've promised that they would diversify, and each time there's some reason not to, COVID, whatever. And Joanna asked for an example of how the impact can be disparate. We represent a company whose product I cannot mention, but it was a startup company in a tough space, and they succeeded wildly. They were really on trend. The big time influencers were talking about them. Everything was great. And then their 2 suppliers stopped being able to supply them with any product, largely because their two suppliers chose the much bigger companies to keep supplying when they started having lockdown issues. And so I always am afraid to go on this client's website, but I did about a week ago, and it still shows all of their products have been sold out. And yes, they were doing a great job with sales, but I know for a fact that all their products are sold out because they don't have any product. And so that's the sort of disparate impact that you see.
And I would just to add to that, not only are smaller and medium-sized companies potentially more exposed because it's harder for them to diversify out. Under the current environment with just COVID, just logistically, it's hard to troubleshoot any of those issues as well. I mean, you can't necessarily just go down to the production line and figure out, troubleshoot what's going on that assuming that there is product that you could get. Simple things like just managing a business has gotten much tougher, because just because of the logistical challenges. Period.
Yeah, and on top of this, we could also need to look at what Washington's doing, like all of the new regulations and kind of statements that, you know, Biden administration, Trump before that make on China, and how that could, you know, wildly be different and unpredictable and impact businesses, both Chinese and foreign, things like sanctions, tariffs, you know, the trade war of China. You know, what's the current picture that you see with how U.S. political or regulatory decisions are affecting, you know, China business?
If I may just like, jump, good. This is one of my favorite data points because, I mean, unless, you know, if somebody, in case nobody's noticed, Washington, D.C. is highly polarized, just like the rest of the country. But there is one bipartisan issue, and that's China. It cuts across both sides. And I think there's even a risk of one side or the other trying to outdo it, the other, in terms of who's going to be tougher on China. That's the momentum currently in DC.
That's a great point. And I think we're going to see that especially in the lead up to the midterms, where China is going to be, like it hasn't been, I would guess, in decades, the fulcrum on which a lot of races get run. And I think I would encourage people to distinguish when they're trying to measure the regulatory risk between Congress, which broadly speaking is very critical of Beijing, different parts of the executive branch, which tend to go office to office, and then local governments around the United States, which have some play on this and really also vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction.
The only thing I would add is that one thing that's been fairly consistent throughout US trade history and with respect to China is that it is not the small and medium companies that tend to get the exemptions. It's, without naming any names, our clients frequently complain about one or two very, very large US companies that seem to have almost skated through all the tariffs. And so if you're a small or medium-sized company, you're just going to get hit with tariffs one day, and there's probably very little you can do about it.
It's just that add on Dan's point there, you know, we've had a lot of conversations with folks in the government who a lot of times want to increase regulation. And on the one hand, great, you know, regulate people so that they're not importing from Xinjiang, but there do tend to be loopholes with all these regulations. And the larger the company is, the more they can spend on law firms and lobbyists to allow them to get around that regulation.
The one point that's a really good point, Isaac, and on the issue of like the lobbying and loopholes, that's fine. That's part of the name of the game. But my perspective, just putting out a practical business perspective, all that does is buy time. That buys time to come up with and affect a strategy to rebalance the exposure. Because just look at where the direction's going, and then use that time wisely.
Mm-hmm. Well,
I'd agree with that.
Overall, decisions from, you know, Congress, Washington is in favor overall for U.S. companies that do business with China, or you know, Brent was talking about how sometimes it's almost a competition between politicians who out-talk each other on China. Do you think that could veer to a direction where the U.S. might be making decisions that are actually overall harmful to, you know, American business interests?
Well, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely, in the sense that whether you agree with the Trump tariffs or not, and frankly, I thought it was time the U.S. did something. There's no doubt that you cannot argue that those tariffs did not negatively impact American business. So any sort of new regulation, sanction, tariff to make things tougher on China will hurt American business.
I think, I agree completely with that. I think what I tell all of my clients is that two things are true about regulations around Xinjiang. One is there's a very strong human rights case for doing so. And the second is the reason why they're happening is less to do with human rights and more about training US businesses to reduce their exposure to China. So Xinjiang is not the culmination, it's the beginning.
And, human rights, what's happening so far are the actions are going to make an impact on pressuring China to look at its treatment of workers, using forced labor.
Yes, and as Brent was saying earlier, it's not just in Xinjiang, it's forced labor transfer to provinces around China, it's Tibet, it's unfair labor practices that don't have anything to do with minorities. So there's other pieces of this as well. And we expect those laws to be enforced a lot more stringently than they were in the past.
Oh, I was just going to add too, it's not just like kind of increased regulation and enforcement, not only from regulatory agencies, but also, there have been congressional investigations that have been picking up as well. So that's another risk area. But it's also, again, unless somebody's been living in a cave the last couple of years, like myself, ESG is a hot topic among shareholders and among your customer base in the US. And it's hard to have this disconnect if you're all for ESG initiatives in the US, but you're getting forced labor or potentially forced labor in your supply chain. That just doesn't fly in this new ESG world. And there's only going to be increased awareness and scrutiny around that from shareholders, from your customer base in the US. Going back to Dan's point made at the beginning, that new survey where something like 70-some percent of Americans favored these tariffs. So the trend is there. I think that we really pay attention.
I'm going to pick up on something Isaac said, which is that the forced labor issue is a way to essentially train companies to leave China. And then I'm going to pick up on something Brent has referred to, which is look at the data points. Janet Yellen the other day talked about what in our law firm we're now calling friend sourcing. She basically said American companies should be looking to do business with countries that essentially share democratic values, or at least are trying to achieve that, or at least are not doing everything in the face of that.
So
it's just a sea change after the end of the Cold War. We had that peace dividend for a long time, and there's assumption that we're in a different world. Geopolitics are back; they're bigger.
The factors are include environmental, social, and governance. We haven't touched on climate yet. The Chinese government says it has its war on pollution. It's committed to working with the U.S. and other Western partners to fight climate change. How do you think this might affect companies? Is it kind of more positive, or is it just one area where different governments and companies are largely more on the same page?
There's two different viewpoints of those who believe climate change is an existential threat to the future. One is that we need to yield to China in order to partner with them to fight climate change. And the other one, which I subscribe to, is that being more assertive and pushing back against China is a better way to fight climate change, both for China and for the United States. And from a regulatory perspective, I would encourage folks to be very aware of what the SEC has been talking about in terms of scope 3 emissions, emissions that cover the full extent of the supply chain, because for so many people, that's basically a proxy for their China emissions. So companies have started to figure out tools to gather data throughout their supply chain so that they're not caught flat-footed if the SEC decides to move forward and really require that for public company disclosures.
I would also expect, I think at a fundamental level, the United States and China have a strong incentive to cooperate on addressing climate change. But here we are today. I would also expect, like, the Chinese government is going to clamp down and have their own regulatory clamp down on domestic business, on companies in China, operating in China. So for example, they have some local district is given emissions targets. So they turn off the power, they turn off the coal-fired power. Well, what does everybody do? The plants then turn on their diesel generators in the meantime to keep the power going, to keep production running. But that, I mean, you're going to see issues along that where the Chinese government is going to be kind of playing its whack-a-mole thing, and it makes a riskier environment.
I'm going to stray a little bit from China and talk about how much of a negative impact the Russia's war on Ukraine has had on the world. It is causing countries to revert to more polluting ways of generating energy because the cost of oil and gas has risen, and it's going to cause a massive increase in food insecurity, particularly in, obviously, emerging market countries. And that's going to have knock-on effects on geopolitics around the world.
Yeah, so we have covered a lot of ground already on how the environment has changed and the impact on different size companies, both from what Chinese government is doing, what the US government is doing, and what is happening in Ukraine and with the pandemic. So moving on to really digging into potential solutions and your suggestions for, our audience members listening today. First with Ukraine, like what can companies do to stay on top of that situation? What is a helpful framework to mitigate the evolving risk connected to, China's level of support for Ukraine and potential US backlash sanctions?
I'm going to go first because I am definitely the least expert on this issue. And I distill it into two very basic things. Number one, have a plan. And everyone's probably laughing like that's pretty obvious. But strangely enough, that never really occurred to me until about a week ago, where I read someone saying that. So you should have a plan of some sort of contingency plan, if A, then B. And I think Isaac and Brent have both already talked a bit about that. But from a legal perspective, what we're always telling our clients is, help us help you lighten your footprint in China. Do you need 50 employees there, or should you maybe just have a contract with a Chinese distributor? And that's the kind of legal work we're doing a lot of these days, is helping companies lighten their footprint. A big company asked us about their situation in China, and I was shocked at how good it was, because I thought that they were in China really deep, but it turns out that they're basically licensing just about everything to 2 or 3 very safe or relatively safe Chinese companies. That's the kind of thing companies need to be thinking about. And they are, because I talked about how our law practice had changed. We used to set up 5 to 10 companies a year in China. And I think we've only done 1 or 2 in the last 3 years. So companies are not just saying, hey, I hear China's got a lot of people, I'm going to jump in.
So we really firmly believe that digital security is, for very sensitive issues, be as undigital as possible. So when you're coming up with a plan, if something as explosive as what would happen if China invades Taiwan and you need to remove all of your employees from Fujian, oftentimes have a very small number of folks who know about that. Often it's a few members of the board, head of security, the CEO, and if, as much as possible with your own compliance, have that in writing as opposed to on the internet, because if a government wants to get into your system, it will. It doesn't need to blow a 0-day for that. It'll find another way to do it. And so just understand that if there's something that's so sensitive you don't want it to leak, have a conversation with folks. I'm glad that COVID is moving in a way that that's a lot more possible than it was before. I'd say specifically on China, Russia, it's similar for companies as for individuals. If you're in China today, you need to have a clear sense, and this needs to spread throughout your employees, clear sense of what the red line is. What would you not do? So, companies in China today, foreign companies, usually have some sort of relationship with the Public Security Bureau and the Ministry of State Security, and train your people that if you start getting certain types of requests, to pass that on to people in the United States, and maybe that's a good indication that it's time to shut the office. A final point on China, Russia, we really do encourage folks to be very aware of what their Chinese partners are doing with Russia and are doing with Ukraine. And for a lot of companies, this just won't be applicable. But if you're in energy, if you're in timber, if you're in foodstuffs, this is something that you should know, because it is not beyond the pale for the company you're working with or as an integral part of your development strategy to be sanctioned or to be in the New York Times or Reuters for the way it's facilitating Russia's military. The companies obviously in aviation, the military space, are another really good ones to work out.
And then for me as like the consultant, to have like the basic framework that I do, and we had an argument or discussion whether or not we wanted to put slides up on here, but anyway, simple framework is just, one is think holistically, plan strategically, and act decisively. So what does that mean? Think holistically, understand what your level of exposure is and where the situation is going, right? So don't just be reactive thinking what's happening today, or we're looking back to where China was when it acceded to the WTO 20 years ago and working on those assumptions. Look at where things are heading and understand all those different pieces. Understand where to impact your supply chain, research and development engineering, sales and distribution, and post merger and acquisition risks. But then be careful too also about, and understand where the rubber meets the road, really on this compliance, the compliance issues. And at the end of the day, that's potential fraud. You'll have there's a risk of individuals overriding whatever directives or policies and procedures you have at a company level. But then as a company, you got to be on top of that, so you're not stuck with that liability in case you get any individual bad actors. But then also when I say plan strategically, be careful about how you're actually doing it. Like there's a great, like let's say on the whole Xinjiang labor issue, you don't want to be like the Swiss retailer H&M, where they said, okay, we're done with that, but then they got all this blowback from China. So really, in the current environment, companies are really caught between a rock and a hard place in this new geopolitical tensions between China and the US and the rest of the world for that matter. So be careful in how that, and I think Isaac and Dad made some good practical points along those lines. And then the third thing is, this is about as wise as having a plan. Do something with it. Actually use it, implement it. So that's all I have with that.
You talk about companies like H&M facing boycotts in China. Sometimes they're actually state-led, and other times it's Chinese nationalists really driving the charge to boycott a certain Western company. Do you think these boycotts and impact are overblown, or do you think it is something companies could plan for?
I think oh, go ahead, Brent.
No, you go ahead. I'll chime in.
I think when companies are boycotted and when the party gets behind it, I would say the impacts are not overblown. I would say what's overblown is the risk of a boycott. I mean, there are thousands of foreign companies operating in China at this level. And we can name the numbers that have had any sort of substantial boycott. So the odds are quite low. And so often someone will say, well, I don't want to say this about Tibet or Taiwan or Xinjiang because I might get boycotted, and they forget about the literally hundreds, if not thousands of times that companies have said and done similar things and had no reaction. The second is that, I forget which foreign company, but there was this great story in the Wall Street Journal about how one of that company's competitors tried to engineer a boycott against that company, and it just failed miserably. And everyone said to the Chinese guy who's doing it, oh, you're just doing this for business reasons. We really love this company. So it's not always going one way.
It reminds me of when, Canada-China relations were at a very tense point because Canada arrested Meng Wanzhou. And there was a call, among nationalists to boycott Canadian goods. But there was like a super long lineup in Sanlitun, Beijing for Canada Goose jackets. And people in line being interviewed were like, I don't care. Like, I want this jacket. Like, there's just too much going on. And I want to buy this. So I think sometimes like the people who are more on the extreme end of this side in China, their voices get amplified because the people with more moderate views don't necessarily want to speak out, even if they're making their consumer decisions and not, complying with calls for boycott.
Yeah, but what you mentioned, Joanna, to me shows how random it can be, because Canada Goose sales were great, but canola oil, which comes from Canada, those sales plunged unbelievably because the Chinese government was basically going to the buyers and saying, hey, I thought you believed in our country and in your parents' pension. Why are you buying this canola oil? So it can be all over the map, and you just don't know.
And I've noticed too, like one thing that I think is underreported is the rise of hyper-nationalism in China. It's something that, it's increased. We have it even, issues in the U.S. and storming the Capitol building, but it's an issue there, and it's been growing for a long time. And if you take a step back, you look at the history of where China was, socialism as an ideology died a long time ago. But what remained was nationalism. And for the last 30 years, there's been healthy and heaping and increasing doses of nationalism fed from this media and propaganda machine. I've been in, I was once, when I was in an internal business development function, being in a sales meeting, and one person stands up and says, we surely want to liberate Taiwan. And it was kind of like, I thought, well, maybe we can get back to our sales objectives for today, as opposed to jumping off to that. But these things can come up. And there's a certain point too where I think the younger generation hasn't been through, they didn't go through the Great Leap, like the 100 Flowers campaign, the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, all that stuff and now they've grown up into this environment where it's a highly charged hyper-nationalist environment. It's something to watch out for, and it can change, and that stuff can just come emerge at any time.
Yeah, so that goes into my next question. People say that the risk right now is low, that China would, quickly in the near future invade Taiwan, but say it looks like it's heading that direction, or it may in the future. Right now, what can companies do to try to prepare for that possibility?
I would say that we are there, that we are at the stage where companies should prepare. And the advantage of the Russian invasion is that it allows company stakeholders to understand why. It's context for them that wasn't there several months ago. And I think it's like Dan and Brent said, it's in some ways very simple. It's have a plan and implement it, and do so very securely. I think the one real problem with the COVID lockdowns is that it's hard to do offsites with your China staff, because the way to do this is you have a meeting in a neutral country and you talk about it and everyone leaves their phone outside. But you can't do that right now. And it's another reason, sadly, why important decisions have to be made outside of China until that can change.
Yeah, I would say that the risk is definitely there. I was actually in the early days of the Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I was thinking that if it was going to go the way Russia had planned or intended, or maybe they didn't have a plan, but the way they wanted it to go, I think there was a high risk that you'd see the Protas Island get snipped. You get that salami slicing and take it. Now it's like, okay, Russia's basically got kind of bogged down in Ukraine, and China's watching that very carefully. But also listen to what the messages are coming from leadership. Mr. Xi said that the Taiwan issue cannot go another generation, period. And he also said that anyone who stands between China and Taiwan will get their head smashed to a bloody pulp. So I think words matter, and that definitely signals an intention. I'm going to pay attention to.
Yeah. So
speaking of words, this is a question for Brent and Isaac because I don't have the answer. But today it was reported that Defense Secretary Lloyd is now saying that the goal of the United States is to weaken Russia. How do you see that impacting China?
I think there's a difference between stated US policy and implied US policy on China. So Blinken, the Secretary of State, would say things like, oh, the US doesn't mean to contain China, that's not strategy. Let me say very clearly, US strategy is to contain China. And
I agree.
US strategy has shifted very radically from where it was under Obama of strengthening China to now weakening China and understanding that the PLA, the party's military, poses a real threat to the US. So I don't think it changes the US-China dynamic. I think it's very unlikely for there to be a repeat of the Cold War where the US partnered with China to push back against Russia. I think it's actually far more likely that the US works with Russia to push back against China. It would certainly take another geopolitical cycle, not the one that we're in this year, but I see that as something that could happen more than a partnership with Beijing.
Actually, ironically, is still sitting on traditional Chinese lands, the northern maritime provinces. So if they're thinking strategically, they would, in Russia, they might be kind of have that in mind.
Mm-hmm. And just to see a bit, because we're talking about, future outlooks and ways to prepare for, things worsening. I think we haven't talked about Hong Kong yet, and I think that's a example where what companies and governments feared would happen actually did happen. Hong Kong quickly lost its, pretty relatively good level of press freedom and rule of law. Now there's a very low trust in the rule of law in Hong Kong because lawyers, judges, all people in all sectors have to comply with the national security law, including foreigners, which really is so vaguely written and includes areas where just contact with foreign entities could be seen as criminal. It's called collusion with foreign forces. So looking at Hong Kong, where did you see, looking at a business perspective, it seems like quite a few companies were kind of caught off guard. How did you see that play out? And were there some examples of foreign companies who were prepared for what did happen and is happening in Hong Kong?
I think the ones that are the most prepared are the ones that left and have drawn down. And I think it's also one of those things, and the ex-journalist in me hates to say this, but it's one of those things that's done better when it's done quietly, so that you're not in the paper about it. And one thing we're seeing is a lot of people realizing that having Hong Kong as the jurisdiction to settle the contracts. Oh, we don't do Beijing, we don't do New York. Let's compromise in Hong Kong. That's been pretty problematic for a lot of folks. They're trying to figure out, okay, can we do London? Is there another place that we can do it? But I think COVID has made Hong Kong a lot less livable, and that's another impetus for companies starting to shift out of it.
I think it's also indicative too of where things are going. So take a step back and look, Hong Kong was supposed to be one country, two systems model that Beijing was presenting to Taiwan as a viable way of peaceful reunification. That's now dead and buried. I mean, it's not, forget about like Xinjiang and Tibet, which are supposed to be autonomous regions in China. I mean, it's gone. And so when you think about, if you remove that option, what's left? And then you should really prepare for it.
I don't even view Hong Kong as a separate issue, and I haven't for a long time. Hong Kong is China, pure and simple. Yes, there are definitely the issues that Isaac raised, but if you're going to look at Hong Kong, you should look at where China's going to be in a year, where China's going to be in 2 years, because that's where Hong Kong's going to be.
Mm-hmm. So I have been asking some of the audience questions throughout, our discussion so far. But if we don't end up getting to your questions, Dan will be answering them on the Harris-Bricken website, and look out
with
for
help from Isaac and Brent and you.
So moving on to future outlooks, because we're already talking about, what might happen, but let's look kind of further into the future. Or let's start with the more short-term future first. How will the debate around China in the 2022 US midterms impact a company's ability to do business in China?
I think it's going to be a lot harsher for B2C companies than B2B companies. So, I mean, Disney is really feeling the burn right now. The NBA, the MLB, a lot of companies have been criticized for this, but companies that are either smaller or not a known consumer brand won't have the same liability because it won't get a congressperson the same attention by going after them. That's one piece. The second piece is really understanding your local jurisdiction. So, one of the senators from Tennessee talks a lot about the United Front. And so, those looking to open a factory in Tennessee should have a sense that possibly some local regulators there might be more concerned about their ties to the United Front, and they should have an answer to that question in their local work.
And Dan, do you think things will change on the IP front in the future?
Yes, and I think they've already changed. What we have seen is that Chinese companies view Western companies as short timers. And they're not wrong for that, because Western companies are looking to get out of China. Now, whether they will or not is another question, but virtually all of them are. I think the latest AmCham study said that 85% are considering it. So the Chinese companies are reacting to that, and they're doing their cost-benefit analyses, and they're saying, am I better off doing business with this American or European company for the next year, or am I better off just stealing their IP? And it used to be the calculus was more like, am I better off doing business with them for the next 5 years or just stealing their IP? Now, if it's a year, because so many are leaving, and there's tremendous anger out there on both sides, the risks have just accelerated. And what we're seeing a lot of is American company will send out bids to, let's say, 5 Chinese companies to have their widgets made. And one of the companies that will have a very low bid is bidding low, not because they intend to ever make the widget for the American or European company, but because they want the widget secrets so they can make it for themselves and never make it for the American company or the European company. And they've gotten very sophisticated with this, because what they do is they not only don't make the widgets, but they take the money to make the widgets and keep acting like they're going to make it. So then the American or European company calls us, and it's 8 months later, they're out $1 million, they have no product, and they're in real trouble. It's bad.
And I think it's also, I think the situation's going to get a little bit worse, because you look at things in context. Where China's at in its stage of economic development, the policymakers are fearful that China gets stuck in this middle income trap. What do they need? They need to increase the productivity. They need technology. How are you going to do that? Well, the road to acquiring foreign companies with their technology, that's basically closed. You've got CFIUS, and now in the European Union, they're moving along those same lines. So that's closed. The second piece is, okay, can you buy it or license it? Well, you've got export controls ratcheting up as well. Well, okay, then another dynamic is also China's drive for self-sufficiency, in which they view as a national security issue in terms of food, energy, and technology. So what does this all bode? This all bodes that the risks for corporate espionage are increasing. And so it's going to get worse before it gets better. So in terms of those risks.
Yeah, and this ties into another audience question. Since the CCP's positions on all the issues we discussed, IP, Xinjiang, Tibet, Taiwan, Hong Kong, kind of this anti-foreign thinking isn't likely going to change, what do you see the end game being? Where are things headed?
You're on mute, Isaac.
The end game is diversification, if not outright decoupling. And I think the idea, it's not that go to India and all your problems are solved. It's that you're over reliant on China. Beijing has been very clear about a lot of these things. And so, I think we all want the same things. We'd love for companies to be able to be successful, and Beijing and Washington have made it clear enough that companies are over reliant on the Chinese market. And so the idea is how to shift.
And it really is diversification. There's not one big place like China was 20, 30 years ago. It's really diversification, and the supply chain issues from COVID and the sort of the breakdown of those global supply chains with just in time. It just kind of shows that it's going to have to be supply chain resiliency is going to be the issue. Even the geopolitical issues aside, I always it was kind of interesting that those extended global supply chains built on kind of a just-in-time method, I thought was a little strange application of a model that was developed, came out of the U.S. in theory, developed in Japan, which is the size of California, and even the industrial in Japan are concentrated in certain areas too. So it's not surprising, like in this global geopolitical shift in tone, where all of a sudden, okay, that becomes an issue as well. So it's going to be diversification.
Yeah, but again, for small companies who may only, be operating one factory or working with one factory in China, like how do they make a decision on where to go next?
It's incredibly difficult, and that's what causes them to be paralyzed. But I'm going to throw out two data points that are actually optimistic. One is that virtually all of our clients complain about being in China. None of our clients who have gotten out of China do anything but gloat about it. So there is there is a rainbow at the end of the tunnel. That's probably mixing a metaphor. The other thing, though, is that everyone talks about getting out of China due to risk and how difficult it's going to be and how expensive it's going to be. That is true in most of the cases. But we have had some clients who, by getting out of China, very quickly gained competitive advantage. We've had clients who have had to move their production to, let's say, Thailand, and they got better quality, lower prices, and no tariffs. We had a client that nearshored, and they got all those things. So it's again, everybody always looks at sort of the median, and you're not the median.
Mm-hmm. So we only have a few minutes left, unfortunately. I could keep talking with you all for hours. Again, unanswered questions will be addressed on the Harris-Fricken blog. And so let's just end on a holistic, long-term outlook for China's political system. Like, where do you see things heading? Is there any cause for optimism?
Silence. I'll go ahead. There was a great book I had, a history professor I had, Jonathan Spence, The Search for Modern China. And it's a book that, it's already 30 years old, but I think the search for modern China continues. And I think, I'm optimistic. I think eventually we'll all get there. But in the meantime, there's going to be some ups and downs. It's going to be a bit of a roller coaster. But the search for modern China continues. And the other thing too is for companies that can just keep in mind that the world has changed. Companies need to adapt along with this. And I'm with Dan on this, where the ones that do this have a strategic competitive advantage over ones that do not, and they won't get blindsided. So
I'm also going to try and end on an optimistic note. After Trump instituted the tariffs, I was, along with a professor from Beida, a visiting professor at University of Warsaw Law School. And that visiting professor from Beida said he wanted to talk to me about the tariffs. And me being a fairly closed-minded American, I thought, I really don't want to talk to this person. He's just going to complain, and I'm going to accuse China of violating this and that trade agreement, and it's not going to be good. And so I avoided it for days, and then finally he said, I'm glad that the U.S. has instituted these tariffs. China is veering this way, and I'm hoping it will lead to reform. And then I came back to the U.S. and I told one of our lawyers, who's probably, I mean, he's lived in China for probably 25 years, and he chastised me. He goes, why would you think some really good law professor at a terrific Chinese university would have a particular view? And I realized he was right. And there are a lot of people in China who do not necessarily like what's going on there, do not want war, etc. And I always revert back to Tunisia, because Tunisia started the Arab Spring, and nobody who's being honest would ever have predicted that it would begin there. You do not know what is going to happen in China tomorrow, a week from now, a year from now, 10 years from now. And those who think that the way things are today will ipso facto be the way things are tomorrow, they're playing into the CCP narrative, which is that everybody is behind the CCP and that everybody in China thinks alike. They don't. The lawyers we deal with tend not to. The lawyers in China.
I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic that one day the Chinese people will get a government and a ruling party that they deserve, as opposed to one that's been foisted on them for generations. I'm also optimistic that there's growing awareness in the United States and in countries around the world about the CCP, about its impact on global businesses. And there's been a lot more focus on the solutions. So I'm heartened to see that. And I do share my co-panelist's general pessimism. I do feel like things, at least in that regard, are changing for the better.
Would you like the final word, Brent?
Just have a plan and do it. Really, I mean, it's just changed. It's understand that the ground has shifted significantly, and understand where it's going, and then then you can be okay. Don't just sit on it. Don't wait for the next geopolitical trigger event that kind of throws everything up. I mean, make it into your regular risk assessments, both at within the company in terms of its compliance structure, but also at the board level. Keep addressing this, right? And really take that mosaic approach. You'll get there's a lot of different noise out there. That signal will be apparent within all the noise.
Well, thank you so much. I learned so much from all three of you. Thank you everyone for joining and for your excellent questions. And yeah, look for the recording if you found this helpful and you would like to share this with your colleagues. And it will be on YouTube soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.